In the pre-dawn darkness of June 4th, 1942, the Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly in all directions, its surface broken only by the white wakes of warships cutting through the swells. Above the horizon, the first hints of sunlight painted the sky a pale orange, but beneath that serene morning calm lay a tension so thick it could be felt in every heartbeat, every breath, every whispered command echoing across steel decks. Two mighty fleets were converging on a tiny speck of coral and sand called Midway, and what happened in the next few hours would determine not just the fate of an island, but the destiny of nations. This was more than a battle. This was the moment when the rising sun of Japanese ambition would collide head-on with American resolve, where the echoes of Pearl Harbor would finally find their answer, and where the very future of the Pacific would be written in fire, smoke, and the courage of men who knew they were fighting for everything that mattered. The stage was set for what would become the most decisive naval engagement of the Second World War, a clash that would shatter one empire's dreams while igniting another's march toward victory. But to understand the magnitude of what was about to unfold at Midway, we must first journey back to the smoke-filled rooms of Tokyo, where Japan's greatest naval strategist was hatching a plan so audacious, so all-encompassing, that its success would have changed the course of history forever. Fleet Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood before a massive chart of the Pacific, his eyes fixed on the tiny dots that represented American naval bases scattered across thousands of miles of ocean. The man who had orchestrated the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor just 6 months earlier now faced a problem that kept him awake at night. Despite that stunning victory, the American aircraft carriers had escaped his trap, and worse still, they had begun to strike back with increasing boldness. The Doolittle raid in April had been the final straw. 16 American bombers had appeared over Tokyo itself, dropping their payloads on the sacred soil of Japan before disappearing into the vast Pacific. The raid had inflicted minimal physical damage, but the psychological wound cut deep into the heart of the Japanese leadership. If American bombers could reach Tokyo, the defensive, then perimeter that Japan had fought so hard to establish was nothing more than an illusion. Yamamoto's solution was characteristically bold and ruthlessly logical. He would force the American Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle by threatening something they could never afford to lose. Midway Atoll, a tiny coral island sitting like a sentinel 1,100 miles northwest of Hawaii, would be his bait. The Americans would have to defend it, and when they did, the combined might of the Imperial Japanese Navy, Wool Todd, be waiting crush them once and for all. The plan that emerged from Japan's naval headquarters was staggering in its scope and complexity. Operation MI would involve nearly every major warship in the Japanese fleet, from the massive battleships that had once ruled the seas to the aircraft carriers that now dominated them. 4 of Japan's finest carriers would spearhead the attack, their decks crowded with the most experienced pilots in the world, veterans who had honed their skills over the skies of China and perfected their techniques during the lightning conquests of the previous year. But Yamamoto's plan suffered from a fatal flaw that would prove more devastating than any enemy torpedo. In his confidence, perhaps even arrogance, he had divided his massive fleet into multiple task forces scattered across hundreds of miles of ocean. The carriers would strike Midway while other forces launched diversionary attacks in the Aleutian Islands. His mighty battleships, including his own flagship, the colossal Yamato, would lurk far to the west, ready to deliver the crushing blow once the American carriers had been lured into the trap. It was a plan that looked perfect on paper, but it assumed that the Americans would dance to Japan's tune, that they would react exactly as Yamamoto predicted, and most critically, that they would remain blind to his intentions until it was far too late to respond effectively. Unknown to the Japanese admiral, deep beneath the tropical sunshine of Pearl Harbor, in a cramped, windowless basement that reeked of cigarette smoke and stale coffee, a small team of American codebreakers was about to shatter those assumptions. Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team at Station HYPO had been waging their own secret war, a battle fought not with guns and torpedoes, but with intercepted radio messages, mathematical calculations, and brilliant deductive reasoning. For months, they had been chipping away at Japan's most secret naval code, designated JN-25B by American intelligence. What had started as fragments and educated guesses had gradually evolved into something far more powerful. By the spring of 1942, Rochefort's team could decrypt significant portions of Japanese naval communications within hours of their transmission. As May progressed, those intercepted messages began to paint a picture that made Rochefort's blood run cold. The Japanese were planning something massive, something that dwarfed even the Pearl Harbor attack in scope and ambition. References to a target designated AF appeared with increasing frequency, along with mentions of a major naval operation scheduled for early June. The race was on to determine what AF represented. Some intelligence analysts in Washington believed it referred to the Hawaiian Islands themselves, while others suggested targets in the Aleutians or even the American West Coast. But Rochefort, drawing on his deep knowledge of Japanese naval strategy and his team's careful analysis of communication patterns, became convinced that AF was Midway Atoll. To prove his theory, Rochefort orchestrated one of the most brilliant deceptions in intelligence history. He arranged for Midway's garrison to transmit an uncoded message reporting that their water distillation plant had broken down and they urgently needed fresh water supplies. Within days, Japanese intelligence reports intercepted by Station HYPO confirmed that AF was short of water. The trap had worked perfectly. Midway was indeed the target, and now the Americans knew exactly when and where the Japanese would strike. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the calm, soft-spoken Texan who commanded the Pacific Fleet from his headquarters overlooking Pearl Harbor, faced an agonizing decision. The intelligence was solid, but his available forces were pitifully small compared to what the Japanese were bringing to bear. He had exactly 3 aircraft carriers at his disposal, and one of them, the Yorktown, was so badly damaged from the recent Battle of the Coral Sea that Navy Yard experts estimated she would need 3 months of repairs before she could return to combat. Nimitz had no intention of waiting 3 months. In one of the most remarkable feats of emergency shipyard work in naval history, Yorktown's repairs were completed in just 72 hours. Welders worked around the clock, cutting away damaged sections and patching holes with steel plates. Her flight deck was reinforced, her fuel systems repaired, and her aircraft complement restored. When she sailed from Pearl Harbor on May 30th, she was far from fully healed, but she was ready to fight. The American plan was deceptively simple. Task Force 16, built around the carriers Enterprise and Hornet under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, would take position northeast of Midway. Task Force 17, centered on the patched-up Yorktown and commanded by Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher, would provide support. Together, they would wait in ambush, using their advanced knowledge of Japanese intentions to turn Yamamoto's trap against him. As the American carriers took their positions in the vast emptiness of the Pacific, their crews knew they were heading into a battle that would test every skill they possessed and demand sacrifices that many would not survive. The odds were heavily stacked against them, but they carried with them something their enemies lacked. They knew exactly what was coming, and they were ready to fight for their nation's survival with everything they had. The sun climbed higher over the Pacific as June 4th dawned, casting long shadows across the flight decks of Japanese carriers that had become floating cities of organized chaos. Aboard the flagship Akagi, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on his bridge, watching as the first wave of attack aircraft prepared for launch. The man who had led the devastating strike on Pearl Harbor now commanded the most powerful carrier force ever assembled, 4 flat-ops carrying over 200 of the finest aircraft in the world, flown by pilots whose skill had been forged in the crucible of countless victories. The attack force that thundered off the Japanese flight decks that morning was a sight to behold. Nakajima Kate torpedo bombers, their sleek forms loaded with armor-piercing bombs instead of their usual fish, formed up alongside Aichi Valdive bombers, while the legendary Mitsubishi Zero fighters weaved protective patterns around their charges. These were the same aircraft types that had brought devastation to Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, and Dutch East Indies. Their pilots wore the same confident expressions, carried the same unshakable belief in their invincibility. As the Japanese strike force disappeared into the morning haze, heading toward the coral atolls of Midway, Admiral Nagumo felt the familiar surge of anticipation that came before battle. His carriers had never been defeated. His pilots had never failed to achieve their objectives, and his enemy had never managed to surprise him. Everything about this operation suggested it would unfold exactly as planned. But 300 miles to the northeast, hidden beneath the endless expanse of blue water, the American carriers were already turning into the wind, their own flight decks alive with the controlled frenzy of combat preparation. Pilots strapped themselves into cockpits, engines coughed to life, and deck crews made their final checks on weapons that would soon decide the fate of nations. The hunters had become the hunted, though only one side knew it yet. The first Japanese bombs began falling on Midway at precisely 6:30 in the morning, turning the tiny island into a cauldron of smoke, flame, and flying debris. Fuel tanks erupted in towering columns of fire, while buildings disintegrated under the hammer blows of high explosives. American defenders hugged the bottom of their foxholes as the earth shook beneath them, but their airfield, though battered, remained operational. More importantly, their radar stations continued to function, tracking the incoming raiders and providing precious intelligence about Japanese strength and intentions. Even as the bombs fell, American aircraft based on Midway were launching their own desperate counterattack. Obsolete Brewster Buffalo fighters clawed for altitude, knowing they were outmatched but determined to sell their lives dearly. Marine dive bombers, some flying antiquated aircraft that belonged in museums, formed up for attacks on the Japanese fleet. Army Air Force B-17 flying fortresses, their crews more accustomed to bombing stationary targets, prepared to test their skills against the most elusive prey in warfare, enemy ships maneuvering at sea. These Midway-based attacks, launched with more courage than hope, achieved little direct damage against the Japanese fleet. The Zeros cut through the obsolete American fighters like wolves' sheep, while the experience among Japanese ship captains maneuvered their vessels with precision that made bombing attacks exercises in futility. But seemingly these futile assaults accomplished something far more valuable than their crews could have imagined. They convinced Admiral Nagumo that Midway's defenses remained dangerously intact and that a second strike would be necessary to complete the job. At 7:15 that morning, Nagumo made the decision that would seal his fate. He ordered the torpedo bombers on his carriers to be rearmed with bombs for a second attack on Midway, directly contradicting Admiral Yamamoto's explicit instructions to keep them ready for anti-ship operations. It seemed like a reasonable tactical adjustment at the time. After all, no American ships had been spotted, and Midway clearly needed further pounding before it could be considered neutralized. The rearming process transformed the Japanese carriers into K-floating powders. Torpedoes were hoisted from bomb bays and replaced with high-explosive bombs, while aviation fuel lines snaked across hangar decks to top off aircraft tanks. Ammunition handlers wheeled carts of ordnance between tightly packed aircraft, and mechanics made final adjustments to engines and weapons systems. The carriers had become precisely what their designers had never intended them to be: warehouses packed with explosives and aviation fuel, with virtually no protection against enemy attack. Unknown to Nagumo, American scout planes had already spotted his fleet and were radioing its position back to the waiting carriers. At 8 o'clock, the first American strike aircraft began launching from Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, their crews knowing they were heading into the most important mission of their lives. These were not the obsolete aircraft that had attacked from Midway, but frontline Navy fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes flown by pilots who had trained for exactly this kind of engagement. The American attack plan was elegant in its simplicity. The slow, vulnerable torpedo bombers would go in first, flying just above the wave tops to avoid radar detection until the last possible moment. Their job was to force the Japanese carriers to maneuver violently, disrupting their formations and drawing their combat air patrol down to sea level. Then, while the Japanese fighters were engaged at low altitude, the dive bombers would arrive from high above, screaming down out of the sun to deliver the killing blow. But plans, however elegant, rarely survive contact with the enemy, and the American strike group soon discovered that finding a moving fleet in the vast Pacific was far more difficult than their briefings had suggested. Radio navigation aids that worked perfectly in training proved unreliable in combat conditions. Cloud formations obscured landmarks, and fuel gauges ticked steadily downward as squadrons wandered across empty ocean, searching desperately for targets that seemed to have vanished into thin air. The torpedo bomber squadrons, flying the slowest aircraft and therefore launched first, found the Japanese fleet through a combination of skill, determination, and sheer luck. But what they found was a nightmare scenario that no amount of training could have prepared them for. The 4 Japanese carriers sailed in a tight formation, surrounded by screening cruisers and destroyers whose anti-aircraft guns filled the sky with deadly metal. Above them, nearly 50 Zero fighters orbited like hungry sharks, their pilots eager to add American scalps to their already impressive tallies. Torpedo Squadron. 8 from the Hornet was the first to attack. 15 Douglas Devastator torpedo bombers led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, a Part Sioux officer who had promised his men he would lead them straight to the enemy no matter what the cost. Waldron kept his word with a vengeance, boring straight through the wall of Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire toward the carrier Soryu. His ancient, obsolete torpedo bombers, already outclassed before the war began, stood no chance against the swarm of Zeros that fell upon them like avenging angels. One by one, the American torpedo bombers were shot down, their crews dying in flames or disappearing beneath the Pacific swells. Waldron's aircraft was among the first to fall, taking with it one of the finest torpedo squadron commanders in the Navy. Behind him, his men pressed their attacks with suicidal courage, knowing they were flying into certain death, but refusing to turn back while there was still a chance of landing a killing blow on the enemy carriers. The slaughter was methodical and complete. All 15 torpedo bombers were destroyed, with only one survivor pulled from the water hours later. The attack from Enterprise's Torpedo Squadron 6 met the same fate, as did most of the planes from Yorktown's Torpedo Squadron 3. In the span of less than an hour, the cream of American naval aviation had been virtually wiped out, their sacrifice seemingly achieving nothing but to add more wreckage to the ocean floor. But appearances, especially in warfare, can be devastatingly deceiving. The torpedo attacks had accomplished exactly what the American planners had hoped, even as they destroyed the men who carried them out. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol had been drawn down to wave-top level to massacre the slow-moving torpedo bombers, leaving the high-altitude approaches virtually undefended. More critically, the violent maneuvering required to avoid the torpedo attacks had scattered the Japanese formation, isolating individual carriers from their mutual support, and making them perfect targets for the dive bombers that were even now approaching from high above. At 10:20 that morning, Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky, leading Enterprise's dive bombers, spotted the Japanese fleet spread out below him like toys in a bathtub. His aircraft had been wandering the Pacific for hours, their fuel running dangerously low, when a lone Japanese destroyer racing northward to rejoin the main fleet provided the navigation beacon that led them straight to their targets. McClusky's decision to follow that destroyer would prove to be one of the most consequential tactical choices in naval history. What McClusky saw as he rolled into his attack dive was every bomber pilot's dream. The Japanese carriers lay beneath him with their flight decks crowded with aircraft being rearmed and refueled, their hangars packed with additional planes and ammunition, fuel lines snaked across their decks like arteries filled with high-octane blood, while ordnance handlers wheeled bombs and torpedoes between tightly packed aircraft. The carriers had become floating volcanoes, needing only the smallest spark to trigger catastrophic eruptions. The dive bombers screamed down through the thin morning air, their dauntless aircraft living up to their name as they plunged toward targets that grew larger with each passing second. Anti-aircraft fire began to fill the sky around them, black puffs of smoke that marked near misses, and the occasional violent explosion that signaled a direct hit. But there were too many American aircraft diving from too many directions for the Japanese gunners to stop them all, and the first bombs began to find their marks with devastating accuracy. The carrier, Akagi, Admiral Nagumo's flagship and the pride of the Japanese fleet, took the first killing blow at exactly 10:22 that morning. A 1,000-pound bomb punched through her flight deck, just behind the midships elevator, detonating among the closely packed aircraft below. The explosion sent a shockwave through the entire ship, but it was what happened next that transformed a manageable hit into a death sentence. The bomb's blast ignited aviation fuel that had been spilled during the frantic rearming operations, and within seconds, Rivers of fire were racing across the hangar deck, engulfing aircraft loaded with bombs and ammunition. The Akagi shuddered as secondary explosions began tearing through her hull. Torpedoes stored in the hangar detonated with tremendous force, their blasts rippling outward like earthquake tremors. Ammunition magazines that should have been flooded for safety instead fed the inferno with continuous explosions that lifted entire sections of deck plating into the air. The flagship that had led the attack on Pearl Harbor was being consumed from within, her steel skeleton glowing cherry red in the hellish heat of her own weapons. Just 2 miles away, the carrier Kaga was suffering an even more catastrophic fate. 4 bombs struck her flight deck in rapid succession, each one finding aircraft packed together like kindling. The first bomb landed among a group of Kate torpedo bombers, their fuel tanks erupting in a fireball that swept across the deck like a tsunami of flame. The second bomb penetrated deeper, exploding in the upper hangar and sending burning aircraft parts cascading into the lower levels. By the time the 4th bomb found its mark, Kaga was already beyond salvation, her entire forward section engulfed in flames that reached hundreds of feet into the sky. The carrier Soryu, smallest of the 4 Japanese flat-tops but arguably the most efficiently designed, took 3 direct hits that sealed her doom with mathematical precision. The first bomb struck her flight deck elevator, jamming it in the up position and trapping aircraft in the hangar below. The second bomb detonated among a cluster of Zero fighters being refueled, creating an explosion so violent that it blew out sections of the ship's side plating. The third bomb, almost as an afterthought, landed among the spare torpedoes stored on the hangar deck, triggering a chain reaction that turned the entire ship into a floating furnace. In less than 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers had been reduced to burning hulks, their flight decks twisted into unrecognizable masses of molten steel, and their hangars transformed into crematoriums for the aircraft and men trapped within. The dive bomber attack had achieved what months of careful planning and positioning had made possible, but the execution required split-second timing and courage that bordered on madness. The American pilots had dove through walls of anti-aircraft fire, their aircraft shuddering under the impact of shell fragments, their windscreens spider-webbing from near misses that should have been direct hits. Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky, leading the attack from Enterprise, felt his aircraft buck and shiver as Japanese shells exploded around him, but his dive remained true, his bomb sight centered on the rising sun painted on Akagi's flight deck. His 1,000-pound bomb fell like divine retribution, its explosion marking the beginning of the end for Japanese naval aviation. Behind him, his pilots pressed their attacks with the precision of surgeons and the ferocity of berserkers, each bomb finding its target with an accuracy that seemed impossible given the chaos swirling around them. The 4th Japanese carrier, Hiryu, had been operating separately from her sisters and escaped the initial American onslaught through sheer luck and distance. Her captain, Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, was a fighting sailor cut from the same cloth as his American opponents, and he wasted no time launching a counterattack against the Americans, who had just destroyed 3/4 of his fleet. His remaining aircraft, 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters, represented the last offensive punch left in the entire Japanese striking force. Yamaguchi's pilots found the American carrier Yorktown at precisely the moment when her crew believed the battle was won. Damage control parties were already beginning repairs from the morning's action when the Japanese dive bombers screamed down out of the afternoon sun, their attack as sudden and devastating as lightning from a clear sky. 3 bombs struck Yorktown's flight deck, penetrating deep into her hull and starting fires that threatened to consume her from within. The American carrier's damage control teams responded with the efficiency that had become legendary throughout the Pacific Fleet. Within 2 hours, they had extinguished the fires, restored power to critical systems, and patched the flight deck well enough to resume flight operations. When the second wave of Japanese attackers arrived, expecting to find a burning hulk, they instead discovered what appeared to be an undamaged carrier making 20 knots and launching fighters. The Japanese pilots, convinced they were attacking a different ship, pressed home their torpedo attack with the same suicidal courage their American counterparts had displayed that morning. 2 torpedoes struck Yorktown's port side, flooding her engine rooms and bringing her to a dead stop. The carrier that had been hastily repaired at Pearl Harbor and rushed into battle was finally succumbing to the accumulated damage of too many fights in too short a time. But even as Yorktown listed heavily to port, her aircraft were already airborne and hunting for the source of the attack. The Japanese had revealed the location of their last carrier, and the Americans were not about to let Hiryu escape the fate that had befallen her sisters. Enterprise and Hornet turned into the wind and began launching every available aircraft, their crews working with the desperate efficiency of men who knew this might be their only chance to complete the destruction of the Japanese fleet. At 4:20 that afternoon, the last act of this Pacific drama reached its climax as American dive bombers found the Hiryu steaming desperately northward, her flight deck empty, her hangars echoing with the ghostly silence of defeat. The bombs that fell upon her were almost anticlimactic after the morning's carnage, but they completed the destruction of what had once been the most powerful naval striking force in history. 4 Japanese carriers lay broken and burning beneath the Pacific sun, their twisted steel frames serving as tombstones for an empire's ambition and the final resting place for hundreds of Japan's finest pilots. In a single day, the balance of power in the Pacific had shifted irrevocably. Japan's dream of an impregnable defensive perimeter stretching from the Aleutians to Australia died with those carriers, along with the irreplaceable pilots and aircrew who had made that dream seem achievable. The United States Navy, written off as defeated just 6 months after Pearl Harbor, had not merely survived the ultimate test, but had emerged victorious against odds that should have guaranteed their destruction. The battle's outcome hinged on factors that no strategic planning could fully control. Intelligence had provided the Americans with priceless advance warning, but courage had transformed that advantage into victory. The sacrifice of the torpedo bomber crews had been the catalyst that made everything else possible, their deaths purchasing the few precious minutes needed for the dive bombers to arrive at exactly the right moment. Japanese overconfidence had created the vulnerabilities, but American determination had exploited them with surgical precision. As the sun set over the Pacific on June 4th, 1942, it illuminated a transformed world. The Japanese fleet limped homeward, its surviving ships carrying news of a catastrophe so complete that many in Tokyo would refuse to believe the initial reports. The American carriers, battered but triumphant, began the long journey back to Pearl Harbor, their crews already knowing they had participated in something that would be remembered as long as nations waged war upon the seas. Midway had become more than a battle. It was the moment when the tide of war turned irrevocably against Japan, when American industrial might and fighting spirit proved that Pearl Harbor had awakened not a defeated nation, but a sleeping giant. The tiny coral atoll that had served as bait in Yamamoto's trap had instead become the graveyard of Japanese naval supremacy and the birthplace of American victory in the Pacific. The echoes of those 5 fatal minutes would reverberate across the Pacific for the remainder of the war, each American advance built upon the foundation laid by the men who had faced impossible odds above the burning Japanese carriers and emerged victorious. In the annals of naval warfare, few battles have been decided so quickly or completely, and none have carried consequences quite so profound for the fate of nations and the course of history itself.